this genuinely might be an entirely biased glaze from me, but I think Chapter 7 of Modelo is perhaps some of Gege's best writing, not only within Modelo, but possibly within the entirety of Jujutsu Kaisen. Chapter 7 brings us Mahito revival, Yuji's status being confirmed somewhat, Tsurugi's cancer diagnosis, and finally, one of the most human conversations in the entire series, in my personal opinion. So let's talk about it.
Like, I hate wasted potential. That shit crushes your spirit. It really does. It crushes your spirit.
Before we get into the video, I just want to ask you all, please be sure to like and subscribe. Follow me on Instagram, and if you really like the effort that I put into these videos, consider supporting me on Patreon. But anyways, Chapter 7 opens up with Chapter 6 finished, having seen our case user once again managing to escape with his life, sticking to the sort of thematics of this case user embodying a childlike persona. He jokes about playing tag for a little while here with none other than Usami, who turns out that Usami is wielding a very familiar case technique, which is actually cased speech. However, you can see how it's changed in the generations since we last seen it, because back in the day, obviously, Inumaki had the markings on his tongue, which in turn made him incapable of being able to speak. However, Usami's markings are on his hand, and he covers his mouth to activate the case technique, almost reminiscent of Yuta using a microphone to speak into, but Usami's now using his hand instead to speak to it. Now, there is some discussion on whether the Modelo cast have grown stronger. Now, based on what we've seen, with Tsurugi using simple domains while being heavily restricted, and now Usami having the case speech being used in this manner, I'd be inclined to say that the Modelo cast might not be stronger, but have definitely found a way to negate the weaknesses from prior generations in exchange for, you know, different ways to use the case techniques. For example, Tsurugi being able to use a simple domain, but having it have multiple spots, which apparently in my own theory here would allow him to move around rather than being stuck in the one area. And now Usami having case speech markings on his hand rather than his mouth, allowing him to effectively communicate normally, but the downside is just that he has to, you know, cover his mouth and able to in order to use this. So, and it is also worth noting that Gege has hid this in plain sight, because in previous chapters Usami is actually seen wearing gloves on his hands, but it's so subtle and it's so like just not there, you wouldn't even notice. But we do get a panel of Usami covering his mouth here, and I couldn't help but feel like this felt like a direct callback to Sukuna in his fight with Gojo. Speaking of which, I have two very large videos covering every single detail in Gojo vs Sukuna and every single detail in the entirety of the Shinjuku Showdown. It's over 4 hours worth of content there, so go and check that out once you've done with this video. Regardless, this case user gets his fucking jaw span and then kicked in the face, while Usami tells Mino that he'll take it from here, and it's here that we cut back to Cross and Tsurugi. Now, Cross essentially takes over the role of Maru within this chapter, quite literally and figuratively, because Maru was knocked unconscious and sent back to the mothership, but Cross and his interactions here really serve to sort of drive not only this chapter, but the whole story further by leaps and bounds within this chapter, I believe. Now, I'd also like to point out that Gege has once again adhered to the Chapter 7 rule, in which by Chapter 7, in most mangas, something big has happened, and this chapter does not disappoint. But Cross and Tsurugi have a really nice interaction here, as Cross questions just what it is that Tsurugi meant by "we're supposed to be neighbors" in Chapter 6, which leads back to a conversation that Maru had with the case user, in which Maru tells the case user a neighbor is a friend who understands why the things that matter to you are so important. Now, upon hearing this, Cross gets even more angry, and it made me wonder if the term neighbors is maybe something sacred to Samrians. Maybe they view it differently. But he mentions how Cross just can't keep his mouth shut before just sounding off on Tsurugi. Quote, "We're supposed to be neighbors. I know your nation's history. You, who secured peace by obeying the path laid out by great powers in the aftermath of your Second World War, are meant to understand us. Being born into a world where you don't have to worry about your own survival, the only condition for you to be born was the blessing of your parents. The rest was already taken care of you by the planet you were born on. You must have deemed us dangerous, filthy, and weak refugees. It's completely spiraled out of your control because you tried to exploit the Kyoto Paranormal Security Treaty to your advantage. Being neighbors with your kind, fat fucking chance." Now, obviously, there is a lot to break down here. Firstly, Cross and his statement here gives us some sort of insight into the world that they've come from. He tells Tsurugi that he didn't have to worry about his own survival because the planet he was born on, which sort of implies that the Samrians may have come from a harsh, maybe inhospitable planet, possibly one where they might have been the only race, or perhaps they're not the apex of that planet. Maybe they are not the top of the food chain. Maybe it's a planet like Arrakis from Dune. Who knows? It sounds hospitable, basically. Secondly, Gege choosing the topic of immigration is fairly interesting to me, given like the current climate of the world, especially the way he's depicting it. Both sides are nervous, both sides are very cautious, and both sides carry baggage from their past actions here. And this is something that Cross touches on here, because he's aware of the world's wars and, quote, peace that has followed it and what they've had to do to get there. And Cross finds this almost annoying. He looks down on Tsurugi and the humans for doing what they needed to do in order to survive, not only as a country, but also as a human species, essentially. But Cross is looking at this history as a black and white subject, and based on that information, he decides that there is fat fucking chance he would be neighbours with your kind. And I think what I love the most about all of this is the hypocrisy. Not only does Cross not understand the complexities of what the humans have gone through, but he assumes that because he and they have not endured the same things, they can't possibly understand each other. And it goes back to what Maru said in Chapter 2. The humans are just like the Samrians. There's good and bad people here. Only Cross just isn't willing to accept that fact. And I am of the belief here that Cross's hypocrisy here is a result of stuff that he's gone through in his homeworld, the trauma that he's gone through, but also when he speaks to Tsurugi, you can see that he has seen reflections of his own people in what Tsurugi is saying. And I think this is very just beautifully written. I could genuinely sit here and make a full-fledged video just about this entire segment in and of itself, breaking it all down, but I think this video is going to be long enough as it is. Now, moving forward here, we get somewhat of a tense interaction between Usami and Cross here. After Cross is telling Usami that Maru will be transported back to the mothership in order for him to get treatment. Now, Usami notes that if Maru returns to the ship injured, it's not likely that it's going to be good for them. It's going to be pretty bad for them. Something that Cross is definitely already well aware of, but regardless, Cross insists that the Samrians will treat him themselves. Notably, Usami waves this off as Cross might be concerned that the humans are trying to understand the Samrians' biology, which obviously does raise some questions. Have they got a third eye? Do they have, like, are their organs the same? Are they different? Who knows? But I can't help but imagine that the Samrian biology within the series is probably just going to be like what Sukuna's was like, in the regard that we're probably going to get a brief summary of it and maybe a brief understanding of it, and then that's sort of it. It's just going to get swept under the rug, and we're just going to be left with our imaginations to deal with that. Anyways, Cross takes Maru's eye patch and styles his hair in the same way like Maru, and then begins to impersonate him, which we will touch on in a little bit later here. But first we arrive at the first big, and I do mean big, reveal within this series and this chapter, and that is that Mahito is still alive and kicking. Kind of. We see Tsurugi, who is unconscious, and in this unconscious state, he is greeted by Mahito, who simply says two things. "What's all this? I thought you were him." Now, just Mahito's appearance and these lines of text gives us a lot. First of all, we need to look at the background of where Mahito actually is, because the last time that we saw him, he was on the path that souls travel before reincarnating along the cycle here, where he had a conversation with Sukuna in Chapter 271. And now we're seeing Mahito with a black background behind him, which is implying that he is still there waiting for someone. Now, I would be willing to bet my left testicle that saying someone is Yuji Itadori. Now, if, a big if, it is Yuji that Mahito is indeed waiting for here, then it confirms that Yuji is indeed still alive and has not travelled this path, meaning somewhere out there, old man Yuji Itadori is walking about. Now, I don't think this was done for fan service. In fact, I fully believe that this moment right here is going to lead to an appearance of Yuji and perhaps an appearance of Mahito entirely. Now, Yuji arriving here and potentially teaching Yuka and Tsurugi how to get stronger is something that I think we're all on board about seeing here. Considering how Gojo was convinced Yuji and the gang were going to be the next versions of himself, they were going to be the guys leading the charge after him. It's something I'd love to see, but I'd love to hear your guys' theories on this. But regardless, this Mahito appearance is absolutely insane, because bear in mind, Mahito is the human disaster case. He's born from the ill intent of humans, essentially. He right now, we're on the precipice of war between the Samrians and the humans, and there is a lot of ill intent going around, which in turn adds another stake to the narrative. Not only must war now be prevented, it must also be prevented before Mahito reincarnates. Now, I have always maintained that Mahito is an entity that, if left unchecked, could absolutely reach the same level of Sukuna, potentially worse, when it comes to levels of strength here, because again, this would also add stakes to the Modeloverse. It's just, given his chaos technique, he is a fucking menace, and he achieved so much in such a short little amount of time. It's insane to think about. Moving further into this chapter, we see Tsurugi waking up in a panic after being greeted by Mahito, and he is then greeted by Cross, who is now posing as Maru, which made me laugh because these two have different markings on their face, but apparently Tsurugi hasn't noticed this at all. Now, earlier I mentioned how Cross fills in for Maru within this chapter. We get to spend some time with him, and we actually get a deeper understanding of Cross's character here. Now, originally, he'd probably done this here. He's probably done this little impersonation gig just to gather information, but I think the longer he spends with Tsurugi, he realizes that they're sort of more alike than he cares to admit, as I mentioned earlier, and this comes off the back of a sincere apology that Tsurugi gives to Cross, who he thinks is actually Maru. Quote, "Maru, I'm sorry for talking about invasions and calling you a freeloader. I didn't quite understand the scope of your circumstances. I do now." And I actually love this because, as I mentioned earlier, this topic of sort of immigration is very, very on point for Gege, given like how the scope of the world is right now. Now, I actually love this because, simply put, all of these issues within the series can stem from a simple lack of understanding when it comes to the humans in the Samrians. Anyways, we do move further into the chapter with Cross going to the fun fair with Tsurugi and Yuka. And these moments are very, very slice of life, but I think it works really, really well given the context. It places Cross into situations that, just simply put, are very human situations. So far, he's only seen the humans as violent and untrustworthy, but this trip to the fun fair proves what Maru told him in Chapter 2 is correct. There are good and bad people amongst the humans here, just like the Samrians have. And this all leads into a moment where this kid pulls up and is lost. Now, bear in mind that the last time they encountered the child, he turned out to be an old dude wearing people's skin. So naturally, Tsurugi here and Mahito, they dash off to find this kid's mother because they're, a lost child and they're a little bit nervous. Understandably so. But I think what is nice here is the parallels that happen between both Cross and Maru. You see, on one hand, you have Maru, the overly trusting and empathetic older brother who stopped to help a child and received nothing but trouble for his efforts, which is obviously the Chaos user. And then on the other hand, we now have Cross, the younger, more suspicious and apathetic brother whose interaction with human child goes in the complete and utter opposite direction. At first, Cross is very confused and almost annoyed by this kid for being upset, but then that emotion slowly melts away ever so slightly as he's trying to impress this child and keep him entertained by doing a backflip. Now, if you've got kids, you know the easiest way to get them to cheer up is to either give them food or be funny. It's just simply how it works. Either or works. Now, this kid, as he's collected by his mother, gives Cross his balloon, and this completely and utterly confuses Cross entirely. He questions why this kid's holding a Halloween balloon, which, by the way, again, the setting of this time of the year, Halloween, same thing, Shibuya, Halloween, very, very on point time in here, and it's also close to Halloween IRL, which is quite funny. Anyway, this brings us round to an interesting conversation between Yuka and Cross, and the two discuss religions, and it's here that Yuka makes it known that she is aware Cross is actually Cross and not Maru, and takes the opportunity to fry her brother also for not noticing, which I do absolutely love. It's completely on brand for their rivalry. I fucking love that idea. But Cross mentions how the Samrians do actually have a god that they believe in, and it's here that Yuka gives Cross a little sort of history into their cultures and religions and lore, basically. And Yuka tells Cross about Fumi, noting how Christianity was banned in Japan long, long ago, and Fumi refers to an event that actually occurred in the 1600s in which Christians were forced to step on a slab with Jesus' picture on it here, or the Virgin Mary, and if they stepped on it, they would be basically proven that they weren't a believer. But if they didn't and they refused or showed hesitancy to step on this, then they would be essentially executed for their beliefs, or they would be imprisoned or tortured for their beliefs. Now, Yuka acknowledges that even if she was a believer, she'd step on it regardless, stating that she could just atone for her sins later, right? It'd be a waste if she just died. But Cross asks Yuka, if it wasn't a picture and it was a living person, would you have still stepped on the slab? And this small interaction is fucking beautiful. It represents two sides of the coin. On one side of the coin, we have Yuka, who is, in this instance, doing what it takes to survive the ordeal. And then on the other side of the coin, we have Cross, who would more than likely die for his beliefs, because he's been on the end of people who are simply doing whatever it takes to survive. I hope you can see how shallow you and your brother's way of thinking is. People like you trampled on our lives unknowingly. There were times they witnessed our blight but refused to take action, and there were times they simply stole from us. Just because you were stolen from doesn't mean you have the right to steal from others. But I also believe people who've endured theft are more likely to engage in that very same thing. I suggest you guys prepare for that. Now, this goes back to what I mentioned earlier about how the Samrians' homeworld might have been inhospitable, maybe a race splintered into sort of different factions, and the group that we're seeing here, the refugees that we're seeing here, are the losing side. But what Cross says here is, as Yuka puts it, that is almost a declaration of war, essentially, from him. And I mentioned earlier how Cross is a hypocrite, but I think that hypocrisy is fueled by past trauma from his events that he's dealt with here. And I think this line of dialogue is the perfect example of that. On one hand, you've got Cross telling Yuka that people like her are the very same people who trampled on his way of living, but on the other hand, Cross is fully prepared to do the same thing to the Earthlings, what he has had happen to him. And in turn, that sort of makes him no different from what Yuka says. Yuka says that she'd step on the slab in order to survive, basically. And Cross questions if she'd do the same thing if it was a living person. But he himself is preparing to do that very same thing to Earth right now. He's preparing to step on living people to secure his own livelihood. Now, it's here that the chapter drops the biggest bombshell yet, and that is that Yuka has cancer and less than 6 months to live. Now, I recently made a video about the Okatsu siblings, focusing more so on Tsurugi's heavenly restriction and how his goal is to get stronger, and how much like Maki, he gets stronger through loss. And that is apparently what is going to happen to him. Gege, you cruel individual. Now, this diagnosis leads Cross and Yuka into a very introspective conversation where Cross tells Yuka, even if you still have half a year left, your heart has run out of steam. Nothing will ever feel the same, and at this point you'll spend the rest of your days spiraling into a vortex of hatred. Why does it have to be me? Why must I endure this? These will always cling to your mind. Your sense of humour, your favourite food, your music view, and so on and so forth will all feel stale. You're always going to think, so what now? I'm gonna die anyway. And I think Yuka asks Cross, is that how you feel? With him replying, yes, your future was also stolen from you, Okatsu Yuka. And it's here that Yuka calls out Cross's hypocrisy. What would you do now, Cross? Would you answer theft with theft and take back what was stolen tenfold? And this reply completely sets Cross off as he exclaims, it's not the same at all. What happened to us was a man-made calamity. It's completely different from a sickness or an accident. And I think this conversation serves to show Cross just how hypocritical he is being. He is still blinded by his past, and he is treating the humans in the same manner as those who have forced him from his home. And Yuka tells him, you might have lost your home, but you haven't lost your life. I will though. And Cross replies with, are you attempting to sway my mind with your own blight? And I think this right here, in and of itself, clear as day, Cross has become the very thing that has pushed him from his own home planet. Cross eventually explodes with being confronted with his own hypocrisy. You think I can be swayed by the ideal of someone who hasn't been through what I've been through? As he says this, he knows it's not even close to being true. Yuka has herself been through a lot, but despite this, his anger sways him further as he just continues to go. You bastards keep blabbering about coexistence, but I'd bet it'll only go so far as existing without displeasing the Earthlings. For how long, I ask you? How long are you expecting us to live, fearing what tomorrow may bring on the whims of you Earthling? I refuse to be bound by such poor, pathetic existence, so I'll steal. And Yuka counters Cross and this burst of emotion with just one simple question. How long are you planning to steal in? And I think this one question to Cross simply answers everything that Cross laid out. Cross plans on stealing from the Earthlings, even while knowing he's a victim of the same thing that he's going to do to them. Despite that, he will steal anyway, while also turning his nose up at Yuka, who said that she would do pretty much anything she could to survive. But Cross wonders how long that coexistence would last, how that fear of the Earthlings would last, how long it would last, and it's simple. Those feelings that Cross has would last for as long as he plans on stealing from the Earthlings. And then I think that right there, Yuka outlining this, she mentions something that I have been talking about in almost every video since Modelo started. Hating someone and stealing from someone is really easy, but isn't that why the wheel keeps spinning? Reverting back to its original position, shall we not break the wheel of destiny together? This constant thematic I've been talking about, Jujutsu Kaisen as a whole, forms in cycles. Story beats repeat themselves, events echo themselves, past, present, and now future, and the story can essentially be boiled down to a cycle. And Yuka acknowledges that Cross is indeed trapped within that cycle, and instead of getting angry with him, is calm and rational, and simply asks, shall we not break this thing together? And I think it is fucking beautiful storytelling from Gege, but the visuals that also accompany this beautiful storytelling from Yuji Iwasaki also need a mention too, particularly this final sequence between Cross and Yuka. When they arrive at the stepstone crossing, Yuka, in every shot that is shown, is always one step ahead of Cross. Not only is she verbally ahead of him, she is also physically ahead of him, letting him and the audience know that she is in charge of this conversation, she is leading the direction of this conversation, and acting almost like a therapist and allowing Cross to essentially talk himself right into the answers, whether he wants to acknowledge it or not. And on top of this, the act of Yuka and Cross crossing this river while trying to sway Cross's mind and his mindset has meaning. Back in chapter 56 of Jujutsu Kaisen, this very same thing was mentioned. Crossing a river and barriers, just that act alone has significant meaning in Jujutsu. This moment not only is a significant moment, but is also a pivotal one for Cross and how he views the world around him. And I'm going to be honest with you, chapter 7 is just beautiful Gege storytelling. It is incredible what this man is able to achieve when he's just able to focus purely on the story. I mean, obviously he has a hand in the storyboards here while Iwasaki does the artwork, but these guys make a fucking phenomenal team. And it genuinely does make me sad that this is only going to be a short series, but I think it's going to be a short but hard-hitting series. I mean, Gege has done more with less chapters when it comes to Jujutsu Kaisen and Gojo's Path Arc, you know? So, I'm expecting greatness here. We are truly fucking back. But with all that being said, that is everything from me. If you've not already, please be sure to like and subscribe. Follow me on Instagram and support the Patreon, and I will catch you guys all in the next one. Much fucking love. Big fucking kisses. Peace.